So I was working out and I decided it would be a good idea to use a podcast from Plague of Gripes as background noise while I was on the cyclette. It was the one where he talks about Scarlet and Violet and puts together a fancy drawing of the worst starter of the game. It was such a bad video. Horrendous. Word vomit. It was so bad in fact that it made me want to write down a script for a video explaining why Scarlet and Violet is bad, but using completely different arguments. Then I realized that looking at the landscape of YouTube, this has already been done to death by now. So that leaves me with a lot of righteous anger and no place in which to channel it for a little while. Around 15 minutes to be precise. Then it came to me like an epiphany. Everyone is wrong about HMs, and I mean everyone. Maybe some boomer will be bitching that Pokemon doesn't play the same way it used to do in the 90s, adding nothing else to the argument, but those aren't real people making real arguments anyway. There used to be some backlash about their removal at first, I think in Generation 7, because Pokemon trained its audience to expect every game to be the exact same every generation, but after the dust settled on that small controversy, I have seen the general consensus be that overall it's a good change for the games. I beg to differ. In fact, I'd like to argue that not only getting rid of HMs made Pokemon worse, but that they should have moved in the opposite direction. Something that I always found fascinating about 2D Pokemon games is their world design, something that I think doesn't get brought up nearly as often when it comes to elaborating on the reasons behind the success of this brand in the first place. And yes, I think the discourse around Pokemon has evolved to the point where most people who analyze the game on a critical level do realize that a big part of its charm is that it's a game that lets you fill in a lot of the blanks and lets you run wild with your creativity. It's very abstract in a way. A lot of it, for the longest time, used to be due to the technical limitations of the handheld consoles. But I think Game Freak, even with their limited experience as game developers when working on Gen 1, understood that a lot of the appeal that came from these games was the real-life interactions that it would have created at school playgrounds. And you can't have that when everything is explained to you right away, when everything is linear. If this kind of mystery and allure is not present, then there would be no Pokemon as we know it today. When it comes to the world design of all Pokemon games, especially the older ones, you might think without any context of the games, like if you've never played them and you looked at a screenshot of like some Pokemon town from the Game Boy Advance, you would think it's weird that these supposedly big cities consist of only a few buildings, right? You might think that it breaks the immersion. But it actually makes a lot of sense when you see it is through the lenses of a kid playing a game that for most of its iterations has consisted in just a bunch of very basic looking sprites on a tiny screen. When you reach a new city, you don't want to like explore its touristic attractions or shit like that. You want to beat the gym leader, you want to see what kind of Pokemon related gimmicks you can find there, and maybe talk with a couple of NPCs to see if they have something interesting to say or if they have something cool to give you. And that's it. You don't need anything else. You don't need to create a city that is super realistic. In fact, it might even be counterproductive to do so, since people would be less inclined to explore the areas presented due to lack of any relevant gameplay element. And of course, this very abstract approach to game design means that when it comes to physical obstacles to overcome, be it in the form of stuff that needs HMs to remove it, or people blocking your way until you do a certain thing in the story, whatever it is, kids, and sometimes even adults too, why not, will find a way to fill the blanks by themselves. With the coming of the third dimension, it's a lot more difficult to find ways to create obstacles that integrate well in the game world without breaking what little immersion is asked from the player, but it's not impossible. Far from it, most games have been doing this just fine over the last 25 years. It's only Pokémon that has been somewhat lagging behind this trend. Game Freak had some sort of existential crisis around the early 10s after the failure of Gen 5. I'm pretty sure everyone here knows how the story went. Black and White flopped, so Game Freak went basically, we are going to make our next games with as little effort as possible. You spoiled brats will fucking like them. And we spoiled brats like them quite a lot according to any measurable metric in existence outside of maybe reviews. And that's the spiral that gets us to games like Scarlet and Violet. But I don't think that's the whole story. Remember that infamous interview where one of the main Pokemon guys, I don't remember the name, talked about not having a battle facility because the STEM zoomers are on their phones all day. Most people saw his response as nothing more than a lazy excuse for why the facility hasn't been around in ages. I think the people at Game Freak actually believe that. This is an excuse only partially, because although it's absolutely true that Pokemon fans will consume and buy absolutely anything that Game Freak throws at them recently, regardless of quality and consumer friendliness, if one day they decided to publish a DLC featuring a fully functional battle facility that is just as complex and full of stuff to do as the one from Emerald, but with all the quality of life improvements made over the course of the years, I don't think it would be as successful as the DLCs that have published during the last 2 generations. Why is that, and why is it important? Because when the vast majority of people buy Pokemon games, they don't look for this kind of content. They want an adventure, they want to go from point A to point B, they want to defeat the bad guys, they want to become champions, they want to catch them all, and they want to do it however they better see fit. And other people want a proper challenge out of these games, either boot up a Pokemon Showdown or pay other people to play these games for them, to build a team for online play and tournaments. All of this to say what? That the world design, both aesthetically and gameplay wise, is a vital part of the experience, and removing HMs makes the whole experience feel less engaging. Pokemon games are piece easy, and that's not a criticism, that's a deliberate design choice which makes all the sense in the world in wanting to make these games have a universal appeal. But that doesn't mean that they can't be too easy. Most people, when bringing this specific point up, will likely refer to games like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or X and Y, in which the battles are clearly not balanced with the universal XP share in mind. That's not what I'm talking about here. Games from older generations are considered rather archaic for a multitude of reasons nowadays, fair enough, but there is some really weird stuff that gets complained about when discussing these games. Like inventory limit, which they got rid of in Gen 2. 90% of RPGs have that. Few of them have inventory limits that are even more restrictive, either in mere size or because they also account for weight and space of each object. I would at best make sure that essential objects don't occupy units in the inventory, but that's it. I don't think there is anything wrong with that mechanic, and I would gladly bring it back for reasons that I will elaborate in a few seconds. Then there is the fact that your team can be replaced at any time in the game map without having to go to the Pokémon Center, and I hate that shit. If you happen to lose a match and you want to swap a couple of Pokemon, you are already a couple of meters away from a PC after being spawned in the Pokémon Center. I would at most allow a player to switch a Pokemon they just captured with another one in your party, but that's it. How does all of this relate to world design and HMs? As much as these modern quality of life improvements help streamline the gameplay, I think it comes at the cost of the overall experience feeling a lot emptier. Actions that would require you to visit a physical place are now hidden behind the menu, and due to the easy difficulty of the battles, an average player can steamroll through all 8 gyms by just walking through the intended path without having to deviate or pre-plan any action. I'm of the opinion that the battles themselves can be just as easy as Game Freak wants them to be, but there should be a minimum of friction in other aspects of the game. Not a lot, just what little necessary to make the map feel like an active part of the gameplay, rather than just a large hallway that you are required to walk through from battle to battle. And that's where HMs come into play. Obstacles that can be overcome by a Pokémon move should be everywhere in the game. You shouldn't be able to walk 10 meters without something that can be moved or destroyed by a Pokemon in your team. But you can't just add a few obstacles all over the map and willy-nilly and call it a day, of course. The majority of these obstacles should be optional, first and foremost, and they should not be hiding anything more than something to loot, excluding special occasions such as post-game dungeons or areas pertaining minor secondary missions. Something that is also of incredible importance to the effectiveness of HMs as a tool to enhance the world map is that the player should be made aware in large advance of the mandatory obstacles that he needs to get rid of before obtaining the proper HMs as often as possible. Either by putting the obstacle in plain sight in an area before the gym in which you obtain the move, or through dialogue exposition if you are talking about exploring new areas. The player should never be in the position of walking for a long stretch only to see a mandatory obstacle for an HM that he doesn't have, which forces him to get all the way back to the previous Pokémon Center to change team. HMs could be made more powerful arguably, but let's be real, it's Pokémon. You can get to the league with a single Pokémon that has cut and Rock Smash to its moveset and you wouldn't even struggle that much. What I would do instead is allow multiple moves to be used as HMs for the same purpose. All cutting moves can replace cut once you learn cut. A bunch of fighting moves can replace Rock Smash in the same way. Certain electric or fire moves can replace Flash, and so on and so forth. That way the moveset of your team can be flexible enough that you don't need to have an HM mule or sacrifice important move slots for Pokemon that you like. I would also add as many HMs as I can get away with. Dive, Rock Climb, Waterfall, Flash, Defog. I'd probably come up with a few new ones that aren't meant to be used in the main story and are also never explicitly explained to the player, just to give them something to think about between one gym challenge and the next. The reason I'm so adamant that HMs should be reintroduced in this specific way isn't just to add more stuff to the map, but also to give a role to Pokemon that otherwise would not have one. Yes, HM news existed already, but that's all they were. You didn't use them to fight, you used them to clear obstacles. I don't think players should have to choose between utility and power when it comes to building a team. And I also don't think the game design should punish the player for leaning too hard into either side. But at the same time, I think there should be a reward for those who can find a balance between both aspects in the form of less backtracking. And that's that. What do you guys think? Am I going insane? Buy Trauma Pro Wrestling now.